Hello everyone, and welcome to the video, the introduction video for topic 1.1 Ethics. All right, welcome. I'm coming to you now from my faculty office, so you'll notice the background's a little different than in some of the other videos. But what we're going to be talking about in this video, or in this topic, is ethics. This is going to be the beginning of our ethics discussion. We'll be talking about this a lot during the rest of the class. So it is part, let me just bring up the little diagram here. It is first of these core topics that you'll notice: law, ethics, agency, and business entities. I have those at the center of this class, of the topics of this class, because we're going to be talking about ethics the entire time. Effectively, this is a class really about two main ideas. One is risk and the other is ethics. And so we will be coming back to the topic of ethics multiple times throughout the class. All right, so let's look a little bit at what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to talk about legal ethics. Legal ethics itself is kind of its own area of law and generally refers to the ethics that govern lawyers. So all lawyers are responsible for complying with what are called the rules of professional conduct, and those are what we generally refer to as legal ethics in the profession. But from your perspective, we're really talking about the ethics of law itself. And so we're going to look at the ethical implications of our laws. So, we often talk about a law as whether it's ethical or not. There have been plenty of examples of unethical laws. So we talk about the difference between what does it mean to be ethical and what does it mean to have a law or a rule, that just because we have a law doesn't necessarily mean that it's ethical. So similarly, just complying with all laws doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is an ethical person. So we have to talk about how do our ethics reflect themselves in our laws. How far do our laws go in regulating ethical conduct? And then the other thing we want to talk about is ethical implications of legal strategies. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, there are many legal strategies that are perfectly legal, perfectly acceptable, but there's some question about whether they're ethical. So a good example of this that you'll hear often in the corporate context is a party to a lawsuit that has a lot of money and has the ability to, as we say, paper the other client, so you can, the other party. So you have the opportunity to bury the other side in so much paper that they can't any longer fight the case, and it forces them to settle. Now, there's nothing necessarily illegal about doing that or against the rules, but there's some question about, is that ethical? Is it ethical to deny somebody their day in court simply because you have more money than they do? But it happens all the time. So this is something that we'll be talking about when we talk about business or legal strategies. Another great example that we'll talk about when we get to the bankruptcy section is bankruptcy itself. So there are many companies that use bankruptcy as a way to get out of having to pay or perform on a contract. That's what bankruptcy allows you to do. So students are often kind of caught off guard when we talk about exactly what sort of benefit you get from filing bankruptcy. There's definitely downsides, but you can walk away from leases, you can not pay on agreements. There's all kinds of benefits to filing bankruptcy that are perfectly legal. In fact, that's what bankruptcy's for. But there's some question about whether that's ethical to do. Is it ethical to sign an agreement, not pay, and then file bankruptcy and avoid any obligation whatsoever? And it happens all the time. Okay, lastly, we're going to talk about ethical decision making. So it's one thing to say that you want to be an ethical person, or that you want to make ethical decisions, or that you want to have an ethical company. It's one thing to say that, but it's a lot more complex to actually do. So what we're going to talk about in this section is the different philosophies, just so you can have a sense of the perspectives that people have on ethics. There's, on one side of the spectrum, you have this idea that all ethics are absolute. They come from the Bible, or they come from philosophical introspection, and so they're discoverable. what is right and what is wrong. Then you go all the way to the other side of the spectrum, and there's a philosophy that says that there is no such thing. There are no ethics, and that every person makes an individual choice, and that there are no ethical rules. And so it's important to understand from yourself when you go into business or when you get a job, where are you on that spectrum, so that you can make decisions about for your company, but also for yourself, and understand where you're coming from and who to partner with. It's very difficult for two partners with very different ethical perspectives to be partners in a business together. And it happens all the time, and it destroys businesses all the time. So it's important to have some introspection, understand for yourself where you are on this spectrum. Okay, so we're going to cover a number of learning objectives. The first one has to do with the ethical philosophies. This is mostly coming out of chapter 4 of the book. So we're going to look at these examples of philosophical ideas, and we're going to look at them as a spectrum. So starting, as I just mentioned on the last slide, starting with the idea that ethics are absolute and going all the way to this idea that there are no ethical standards. And then looking at how they relate to each other, how do they fall along this spectrum. Then we're also going to spend a little bit of time looking at the culture here in the United States. Where does our cultural philosophy, ethical philosophy come from? It's important to understand that. It's also important to understand when you're dealing globally with the ethical philosophy of the country that you're transacting with. Okay, then we're going to look at how ethics affects public policy. We're going to spend some time defining the term public policy so that you understand what that means. It's generally just a preview. It's law, but it's also other ways that the government can affect policy. For example, by spending money. So sometimes the government can encourage people to act a certain way simply by deciding what to fund and what not to fund, as opposed to making a rule that becomes part of a law. So we're going to talk about that and how ethical philosophies affect public policy. Lastly, we're going to look at how businesses are regulated, because this is the main way that our ethical philosophy flows down through to the everyday business owner and business manager. It's through regulation. So the government implements regulation to encourage, discourage, punish certain kinds of behavior, and so it does that through an ethical lens. And so we're going to be examining all kinds of regulation in this class, and it's important to always understand the public policy behind it and the regulatory objective behind it. And regulation, by the way, is a huge political issue. So you see this come up whenever there's a change in administrations, like we've just had recently. The Trump administration unwinds regulations that were implemented by the Obama administration, and the Obama administration did the same thing when it took over for the Bush administration. So regulation is one of those things that evolves and changes and is very connected to the political process. All right, so on the next slide, I think I need to make myself disappear. Okay, so for this topic, you're going to be reading chapter 4. So your first objective is to read the chapter, make sure you've read it, then take the reading quiz. That is graded, so make sure that you've done that. It's part of your grade. Then when you're done with that, move on to the self-study materials. We have 3 learning objectives in this topic that I just summarized on the slide before, 2 slides before. So make sure that you have gone through all of the Sakai material. And when you're done doing that, make sure to check your knowledge. There's a short quiz at the bottom. It's not graded, but it is highly encouraged that you do that as part of understanding the material before we get together in the activity class. Make sure that you feel comfortable with the learning objectives and that you've taken the check your knowledge questions or quizzes. Okay, then at the end of topic 1.1, or as you're going through it, make sure to participate in the online discussion. This is a very important part of this class, and I will be participating in them. And your participation grade is partly a result of how you participate in the discussion. So please make sure, ask a question pose a question to someone else, answer somebody else's question. I would like it to be as active as an online discussion as we can possibly make it during the week in between our meetings. Okay, and then you'll have some prep to do before the activity class. So make sure that you've read the hypothetical cases on page 34 and be prepared to answer those. We'll be going through them in class. And then read the Wells Fargo case. It's not a case, it's just an article. There's also some questions, so please make sure that you are prepared to answer and discuss those questions when we meet for our activity class. And lastly, we're going to be starting work on the blog post, so please visit SCOTUS blog and LootBizLaw and start looking around for a topic. Read some previous posts, look at what's happening with the Supreme Court in the current term, and start thinking about what you'd like to write about. It's also important that you look at the requirements document for the assignment so that you know what kind of case that you're going to be looking for to write about. And we're going to be working on that a little bit every week. Okay, as usual, if you have questions, please make sure to email me or post a question to the forum. I'm available in my office hours. You can reach me by phone, which I don't really answer that often. So the best way is email, and you can always make an appointment if my office hours are not convenient for you, or we can always make a time to connect on Google Hangouts. All right, thank you for watching the video, and we'll see you in the next video.